When asked about Palestine, the majority of people, the facts they know about Palestine is the Palestinian flag, the occupation, and the hope of a free Palestine. So this is a short presentation, hopefully to give you more information about what you need to know about the Palestinian struggle. My name is Ahmed Bakr. Assalamu alaikum. In 1917, Palestine, which was at the time part of the Ottoman Empire, fell under the British occupation, and the British armies entered Palestine in 1917. In precisely December 1917, the British army entered Palestine. A month before that, that's in November 1917, the Balfour Declaration was issued by the British government to the Jewish Zionist organizations in the UK, granting them the promise to establish a homeland for the Jews in the land of Palestine. The common story behind that, which is still used by most of the Zionists, that it was a land without people for people without land. And interestingly, as I said, that was even before the British army entered Palestine. So the land of the Palestinians was given by the British, who didn't have the land, to the Zionist organization, who had no rights in the land. But Palestine was a land with people, with advanced people, a school for blind children, 1935 in Hebron. The Arab Medical Conference, 1933 in Jerusalem, schools, libraries, high streets, football matches in 1908. I think this is the date of the photo. So it was an advanced society, a complex society, and a very well developed society compared to the rest of the region, at least. Palestine became, under the British mandate, became part of the British Empire, and the British were facilitating the Jewish migration into Palestine, primarily from Europe. Hundreds of thousands were encouraged, supported, and helped to settle in Palestine with the help of the Zionist organization and the British administration in Palestine. And that increased the population of the Jewish population in Palestine exponentially, and helped them to fulfill the Balfour Declaration. This is the famous map known as the disappearing Palestine, and there is a conflict about this because the UN plan in 1947, the UN interfered. The British were preparing to withdraw from Palestine, and the Zionist organizations were preparing to take over the whole of the country. The conflict was rising, so the United Nations proposed the resolution known as the partition, by dividing the country into two sections. Part of Israel, part becomes Palestine, part ruled by the Jews, part ruled by the Arabs. Importantly, the Arabs, not Muslims, because that's one of the misconceptions. The Arabs, they're majority Muslims, but they're Christians, they're Druze, they're Baha'is, the different sections, and other ethnic minorities within the Palestinians were given 50% of the land, despite the fact that at the time the Jews had only control over 6% of the land, despite the fact of the different percentage in the population, where the Jews were less than 25% of the population, could be 30%, depending on which article you read. They were given 50% of the land. The Arabs, through the Arab League, after debating and thinking about the resolution, they rejected the resolution. The Zionist organizations, this was not the dream. This is not what they came for. This is not what they set themselves for. They wanted the whole thing. So internally, they refused the plan. They didn't want to comment till they knew firmly that the Arabs refused the plan. Once the Arabs refused the plan, within an hour, they submitted their answer to the UN resolution, the UN Security Council, saying, we accept the plan, knowingly that the plan will not be implemented. But prior to the Arab rejection, they already rejected the plans publicly and in all their discussions. But once they secured that the plan will not be implemented, political game, they said they've accepted the plan. Palestinians knew that they had no other choice but to fight for their land, to fight for to keep Palestine united and for the Palestinians. So they started taking up arms, and in the folk there are many songs where women would be selling their jewelries for the men to go and buy a gun. It wasn't as easy as you think. It's much more harder because the British had made sure that the Palestinians will not have access to guns, they will not have access to active resistance. Having a gun, having a bullet could be enough for execution by the British. And the Zionist organizations had organized armies. So the Palestinians have these primitive gun machines, Palestinian factions that started formalizing themselves, very symbolic, very unorganized, very unhelpful support from the Arab nations, from the Arab League. Some of it were significant because some of it meant that the Jerusalem didn't fall in 1948, but overall it was really not helpful. And the Arabs, the Palestinians, had these primitive guns, and they had to face the Palestinians had to face this: a well-equipped, advanced, prepared, organized armies, factions in the Jewish settlers, the organizations that evolved into the Israeli army. So they had no chance. So the war started. The balance of power was tipped in that one direction. So the Palestinians start to lose their houses, start to lose their villages, massacre after massacres, start to flee the country, flee the place, and they started to have refugees, Palestinian refugees, refugee camps start to pop up everywhere in the region, and Israel achieved their goal. And this is the refugees. These maps available everywhere, but what I want to highlight here is this. These are refugee camps. These are refugee camps in all neighboring countries that popped up after the 1948. And important to note the numbers of the refugees, and important to see that, like Gaza Strip, there are nearly a million refugees, over a million refugees who live in Gaza Strip. So these are people who were forced to flee their homes and towns, move to Gaza or move to the West Bank, lived in refugee camps to end up again under occupation. And of course, the Palestinian diaspora in the surrounding countries is another story of struggle, another story of suffering, and it's another part of the conflict. You need to understand how many refugees there are and how is that impacting any solution proposed for this conflict. So Israel took this shape. This is what became to be Israel, and this what is left of Palestine, the Palestinian territories. That's the West Bank and Gaza. And that's the West Bank entered a unification with the East Bank, which was the Transjordan, to become part of Jordan. Gaza was controlled by Egypt. Um, and I don't know why. Well, there are many things I could speculate, but the Palestinians didn't establish a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza. But the main thing was, at that time, till then, the whole thing of the issue of Palestine was controlled by the other Arab states, and that was a lost opportunity. 1967 war broke. Um, and in my other presentation, I have there is a link in the bio. I've talked about more details, the circumstances around in 1967. But the bottom line, the Arab armies all defeated by the Israeli armies, and the Israeli prime minister visited the eastern side of Jerusalem, which all became under the Israeli occupation. More immigration, and for technical reasons, they were not refugees, but they called migrants. That's my parents and myself and my descendants. Um, that's another thing about the complexity of definitions in this conflict. And Israel area rose exponentially from 20,000 to over 80 plus thousand square kilometers after controlling the Sinai, the Golan Heights, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip after winning the war. Important to note, a side note, the distance between an area here, like in the border of the West Bank, a village here on the West Bank and Tel Aviv, is just under 6 miles. And there are people living there who've never seen the sea because they live under occupation. Another milestone came to the story, which was 1987. The first Intifada broke out. It started in December 1987, and that lasted for nearly 6 years. The Palestinian resistance was internal, was continuous, and was the stones facing the mighty Israeli army. In 1993, it was the peace processes, the Oslo Accords, the Washington famous handshake, and the peace plans. Rabin was assassinated by radical Jewish organizations, radical Jew, who assassinated Rabin, and he was considered that he was giving up the Israel or the Jewish or the Zionist dream because he entered into these peace talks with the Palestinians and was offering them peace. Interestingly, most of my life, before I was born, and I'm sure for years later, Zionists will say we always were waiting for peace, and when there was an opportunity for peace, they're the one who destroyed it. There are much more details to that, but that's one of the main highlights. The peace talks started in '93, and to the best of my knowledge, they're still going. 2005, Ariel Sharon, the then Israeli prime minister, decided to withdraw from Gaza, single-side withdrawal, and it wasn't a kind gesture. It was simply the cost of occupation was rising. It was more costly to occupy the land than control it from externally. And it's easy to control Gaza externally. Gaza waters are controlled by the Israeli Navy. Gaza borders, most of its borders are with Israel, so it's easy to control. The only other scapegoat they have is with Egypt, who's a very close ally to Israel, rather it was close ally to the Gazans and the Palestinians living there. In 2007, Israel imposed a strict blockade on Gaza, and 14 years later, the blockade is still in place. Another part of this war is the culture war, and Israel has actively been involved in this. And there are two things. Israel, one thing that things that are known traditionally as Palestinians, like Palestinian dishes, falafel, majul tamur, hummus, tabbouleh, dishes, food, all sorts of dress for women dresses, all sorts of things that Israel presented as part of its heritage. And try to sell that to the world as that Israeli produce and Israeli heritage. And that's one thing. The other thing which is important, Golda Meir in the early 70s commissioned the Mossad to start assassinating Palestinian poets and writers and other intellectuals, actively pursuing them through Europe, in others, in Lebanon, in Syria, and different places, to assassinate the idea. Trying to kill people who are talking or trying to inform the generations of the history of Palestine, the struggle of the Palestinians, and the story of the Palestinians. Because the idea is simple: the old people will die, according to Golda Meir, and the young people will forget. And I hope we prove her wrong. The old people, maybe they have died, but the young people have not forgotten. We still pass this generation to generation our roots in the land, our history, our tradition, our culture, our identity as Palestinians. And I hope everyone can support justice, support standing up to oppression, and support the Palestinians, their rights to live as free human beings. Thank you.